The truth about Mackenzie Shirilla's murder case. It started with a car speeding through the streets of Strongsville, Ohio in the middle of the night. Not weaving through traffic. Not trying to escape police. Just moving faster and faster towards something nobody inside that vehicle would survive. By the time the crash was over, 2 young men were dead. The driver, a teenage girl named Mackenzie Shirilla, was still alive. And within months, prosecutors would accuse her of doing something almost impossible to understand.
I don't know what
not
to
causing
do.
an accident.
We'll figure it out.
Not losing
I'm
control.
Scared.
But
Me
intentionally
too.
driving her car into a building at nearly 100 miles per hour. A decision, they argued, that turned a late-night drive into murder. The case shocked people across the country because almost immediately the story split into 2 completely different versions. In one version, Mackenzie Shirilla was a heartbroken teenager involved in a terrible crash. Young, emotional, reckless maybe, but not a killer. In the other version, she was something far darker. A teenager who deliberately chose to end 3 lives, including her own, after relationship problems and emotional conflict spiraled out of control. And what made the case so disturbing was this. Both sides believed the evidence clearly supported them. That is why the case became one of the most emotionally divisive true crime stories in recent years. Because underneath the headlines was a terrifying question. How do you prove what someone intended in the final seconds before a crash? That question would eventually decide everything. But before the courtroom arguments, before the viral social media debates, before the murder conviction that shocked millions of people, there were simply 3 teenagers driving together late at night. And none of them knew they were moving toward the final minutes of their lives. The crash happened on July 31, 2022. The vehicle involved was a Toyota Camry carrying 3 people. Mackenzie Shirilla was behind the wheel. In the passenger seat was her boyfriend, Dominic Russo. Another friend, Davion Flanagan, was also inside the vehicle. All 3 were teenagers. The drive began like countless others involving young people out late at night. Music, phones, conversation, the feeling of freedom that often comes with being young and away from adults for a few hours. But investigators later said the atmosphere inside that vehicle may not have been calm at all. According to prosecutors, there had been emotional tension between Mackenzie and Dominic before the crash. Court testimony later revealed arguments, emotional struggles, and messages exchanged in the days leading up to the incident. And prosecutors believed those emotions mattered, because what happened next did not look normal. Surveillance footage and crash data showed the vehicle accelerating rapidly before leaving the roadway and slamming directly into a commercial building. The impact was catastrophic. The car burst into flames. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan both died from injuries caused by the crash. Mackenzie Shirilla survived. That fact alone became one of the most talked about details in the case. How did the driver survive while the passengers died? Almost immediately, investigators began examining whether this was truly an accident. And what they found started pushing the case in a much darker direction. Police reviewed surveillance footage showing the car speeding through nearby streets moments before impact. Investigators studied crash reconstruction evidence, including speed calculations and steering behavior before the collision. According to prosecutors, the evidence showed something important. There were no visible signs of braking, no attempt to avoid impact, no indication the driver tried to save the vehicle at the last second. Instead, prosecutors argued the car remained aimed directly at the building. That interpretation became central to the entire case. Because if there was no attempt to stop, investigators believed the crash may have been intentional. And if the crash was intentional, the legal consequences changed completely. The case moved from reckless driving to murder. That shift stunned many people. Murder cases involving vehicles are not unheard of, but proving intent is extremely difficult. Drivers lose control for many reasons: panic, distraction, emotional distress, mechanical failure. Young drivers especially can make reckless decisions without intending to kill anyone. That became one of the strongest arguments from the defense. They argued this was a tragic accident involving an inexperienced teenage driver, not a calculated murder plan. The defense pushed back heavily against the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. They questioned whether emotional text messages and relationship problems truly proved murderous intent. They argued prosecutors were trying to turn a terrible crash into something much more sinister. And outside the courtroom, public opinion became deeply divided. Some people believed the prosecution's theory immediately. The speed of the vehicle, the direct path toward the building, and the lack of braking all felt impossible to ignore. Others believed the state was overreaching, because emotionally unstable teenagers sometimes act recklessly without fully understanding consequences. Many people questioned whether someone so young could truly form the deliberate intent prosecutors described. That debate spread everywhere online. TikTok, YouTube, crime forums, news comment sections. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about what happened inside that car during those final moments. But eventually, the case moved beyond public speculation and into court. And that is where the story became even more emotional. Because once testimony began, the case stopped feeling like an internet debate and started feeling painfully human. Families entered the courtroom carrying unimaginable grief. Parents who lost sons. Friends trying to understand how an ordinary night became a funeral. And at the center of it all sat a teenage girl facing accusations that could define the rest of her life forever. During trial proceedings, prosecutors focused heavily on the idea of intention. Not recklessness, not carelessness. Intention. They argued the crash scene itself told the story. The speed, the direction of travel, the absence of braking, the direct impact into the building. They also introduced evidence involving Mackenzie's emotional state before the crash. Prosecutors argued she was emotionally upset and intentionally drove into the building after conflict involving her relationship with Dominic Russo. The defense strongly disagreed. They argued there was no direct evidence proving a murder plan. No confession. No written statement announcing intent. No witness hearing Mackenzie say she planned to kill anyone. And that became one of the biggest legal questions in the case. Can intention be proven entirely through actions? The prosecution said yes. The defense said no. The judge ultimately sided with the prosecution. In August 2023, Mackenzie Shirilla was convicted of murder and other charges connected to the deaths of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. The verdict shocked many people not only because of the conviction itself, but because of how young everyone involved was. 3 teenagers, 2 dead, 1 sentenced to spend much of her life in prison. And yet, even after the conviction, public debate did not stop. Because cases like this disturb people in a very specific way. There was no robbery. No gang violence, no serial killer, just ordinary young people whose lives collapsed in a matter of seconds. That makes the story feel frighteningly close to normal life. Most people can understand reckless teenage behavior, emotional fights, dangerous driving, poor decisions made in moments of anger or sadness. But murder, that word changes everything. And for many people following the case, the hardest part was deciding whether the evidence truly crossed that line. Even now, arguments about the case continue online. Some believe the evidence clearly showed intentional murder. Others believe the crash, while reckless and tragic, should never have resulted in a murder conviction. That tension may never fully disappear, because unlike many true crime cases, this one did not revolve around hidden criminals or secret conspiracies. It revolved around interpretation. What did the final seconds before the crash actually mean? Was the driver trying to die? Trying to scare someone? Acting emotionally without thinking? Or intentionally committing murder? The horrifying truth is that only one person inside that vehicle survived to fully know what happened in those final moments. And because of that, the case may always carry uncertainty no matter how strong people feel about the verdict. But one fact remains undeniable. 2 young men lost their lives that night. Families were destroyed. And one teenage decision changed multiple lives forever in less than 10 seconds. That is what makes the story of Mackenzie Shirilla so haunting. Not because it feels distant, but because it feels terrifyingly possible. The hardest part about cases like this is that they force people to separate emotion from evidence. And that is almost impossible when teenagers are involved. Because when most people first heard about the crash involving Mackenzie Shirilla, They did not see a hardened criminal. They saw a young girl, a teenager, someone close in age to millions of kids still sitting in classrooms every day across America. That image mattered. It shaped how people understood the case before the trial even began. But prosecutors believed the evidence told a much darker story than the public initially realized. And as investigators reconstructed the final moments before the crash, they became increasingly convinced this was not simply reckless driving. According to court testimony, the Toyota Camry reached speeds close to 100 miles per hour before impact. Surveillance footage captured the vehicle moving rapidly through nearby streets late at night. Investigators studied steering movement, acceleration data, and the path of the vehicle leading directly into the commercial building. One detail became especially important. There was no evidence of braking. That fact appeared repeatedly throughout the trial because prosecutors believed it revealed intent. They argued that in most crashes, especially at extreme speed, drivers instinctively try to avoid impact at the last second. Even frightened or inexperienced drivers often react automatically. But according to prosecutors, that did not happen here. The car stayed on course. The speed continued increasing, and seconds later, the vehicle slammed into the building with catastrophic force. To the prosecution, those final moments looked deliberate. To the defense, they looked tragic but still uncertain. And that uncertainty became the center of the entire case. Because proving murder requires more than proving someone caused death. Prosecutors had to convince the court that Mackenzie Shirilla intended to kill. Not accidentally, not recklessly, intentionally. That is a very difficult thing to prove inside someone else's mind. And the defense attacked that issue aggressively. Defense attorneys argued there was no direct confession, no written murder plan, and no clear statement from Mackenzie saying she intended to kill anyone. They argued prosecutors were building a theory almost entirely around interpretation of crash evidence and emotional behavior. Teenagers, they said, often make reckless decisions without fully understanding consequences. That argument resonated with many people following the trial. Because adolescence itself is emotionally unstable. Young people fight. They overreact. They struggle with emotional regulation. Sometimes they drive dangerously without intending catastrophic outcomes. The defense wanted the court to see the crash through that lens. Terrible decision. A deadly mistake. But not murder. The prosecution viewed the situation very differently. They focused heavily on the emotional context leading up to the crash. According to testimony presented during trial, there had been relationship problems between Mackenzie and Dominic Russo before the incident. Prosecutors argued those emotional tensions mattered because they believed the crash happened during a moment of emotional crisis. And emotionally charged crimes are often difficult to fully understand afterward. People imagine murder as cold calculation, planning, weapons, obvious criminal behavior. But prosecutors argued some killings happen in moments of emotional intensity instead. A decision made in seconds. A choice fueled by anger, despair, or emotional instability. That became their theory of the case. Not long-term planning, but intentional action during emotional collapse. And as the trial continued, the courtroom atmosphere became increasingly emotional. Families of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan listened as attorneys debated the final moments of their sons' lives. Witnesses described the violence of the crash. Investigators explained the force of impact. Crash experts reconstructed what likely happened inside the vehicle during those final seconds. The details were horrifying. The car hit the building with enormous force before bursting into flames. The destruction was so severe that survival for the passengers became impossible. Yet somehow Mackenzie Shirilla survived. That fact continued shaping public discussion throughout the trial. Some people viewed it as suspicious. Others viewed it as random survival in an extremely violent crash. Experts explained that survival outcomes in collisions can depend heavily on seating positions, impact angles, and countless unpredictable physical factors. Still, emotionally, the detail remained difficult for many people to process. 2 dead, 1 survivor, and the survivor accused of intentionally causing the crash. That combination turned the story into national true crime fascination. Online, people argued constantly about the evidence. Some believed the prosecution's theory made complete sense. The speed, the lack of braking, the emotional conflict before the crash. Together, those details painted a picture they found impossible to ignore. Others believed prosecutors were stretching uncertain evidence into murder because the crash looked emotionally disturbing. That split reflected something deeper about the case itself. The evidence did not create emotional certainty for everyone. And cases involving intent often divide people exactly that way. Because intent cannot be photographed directly. It must be inferred, interpreted, built piece by piece through behavior, actions, circumstances, and evidence. That process always leaves room for disagreement. During closing arguments, prosecutors emphasized the crash reconstruction repeatedly. They argued the evidence showed purposeful acceleration directly into the building. They said the lack of evasive action proved the collision was intentional. The defense responded by warning against turning assumptions into certainty. They argued emotional teenagers can behave recklessly without consciously deciding to commit murder. And then the decision moved to the judge. Because Mackenzie Shirilla chose a bench trial instead of a jury trial. That meant the judge alone would decide guilt or innocence. That detail mattered. Bench trials often feel emotionally different from jury trials because the decision rests entirely on one person's interpretation of evidence and law. No group discussion. No jury room debate, just a judge analyzing testimony, facts, and legal standards. In August 2023, the verdict arrived. The judge convicted Mackenzie Shirilla of murder and related charges connected to the deaths of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. The ruling immediately reignited national debate. Supporters of the conviction argued the evidence clearly showed intent. Critics argued the state had effectively criminalized reckless driving as murder without enough direct proof. But inside the courtroom, the emotional reality remained unavoidable regardless of legal arguments. 2 young men were gone forever, and another young life was now permanently changed by prison. That emotional weight became even heavier during sentencing. Family members of the victims spoke publicly about grief, anger, and loss. Statements described the devastation caused by the crash. Parents discussed futures stolen from their sons. Friends described the emotional shock still affecting everyone connected to the victims. Moments like those are often the hardest parts of true crime cases. Not legal strategy, not dramatic evidence, but ordinary people trying to describe grief after sudden tragedy. And in cases involving young victims, that grief often feels especially overwhelming because people cannot stop imagining the futures that disappeared. College, careers, marriage, children, entire lifetimes erased in seconds. The defense also spoke about youth during sentencing, though from a different perspective. Attorneys argued that Mackenzie herself was still extremely young and emotionally immature at the time of the crash. That argument reflects another major tension in the American justice system. How should courts treat serious crimes committed by teenagers? Science shows adolescent brains are still developing, especially areas involving impulse control and emotional regulation. Courts sometimes consider youth as a mitigating factor because young people often make decisions differently than adults. But violent outcomes still carry consequences. And in this case, the consequences were irreversible. Eventually, the judge sentenced Mackenzie Shirilla to prison. The sentence shocked many people because of her age. And yet, for other people, the punishment felt justified because of the lives lost. That division never disappeared after sentencing. Even today, online discussions about the case remain deeply emotional. Some people continue viewing the crash as intentional murder beyond reasonable doubt. Others still believe the conviction went too far. That lingering disagreement is part of what keeps the case alive in public conversation. Because unlike many true crime stories, this case does not revolve around hidden evidence or unknown suspects. Most facts are publicly known. The disagreement comes from interpretation. What did the final seconds before the crash truly mean? And perhaps that question will never completely disappear. Because the only person capable of fully explaining those final moments survived the crash herself. Everyone else involved is gone. that reality leaves permanent uncertainty no matter how strongly people feel about the verdict. But maybe the most haunting part of the story is not the legal outcome. It is how ordinary the beginning felt. Teenagers driving late at night, emotions running high, a relationship struggling, a car moving through suburban streets. Nothing about those moments looked extraordinary until suddenly everything became irreversible. And that may be why the story affected so many people emotionally, because it does not feel distant from normal life. It feels frighteningly close to it. That is what makes the case of Mackenzie Shirilla so unsettling long after the headlines faded. Not simply because people died, but because the entire tragedy unfolded in less than 10 seconds. And in those final seconds, multiple lives changed forever.